And yeah, okay. Well, let's get started. So normally on our Bible studies, we start with a collect for Scripture from the second Sunday of Advent, I think. And this for this class, I want us to start to every week pray the collect for Trinity Sunday, which we just actually had. And so we'll pray this together each week. And because I think this gives us some context for why we're doing this class. So the Lord be with you. Let us pray all together. Almighty and everlasting God, who hast given unto us thy servants grace, by the confession of a true faith, to acknowledge the glory of the eternal Trinity, and in the power of the divine majesty to worship the unity. We beseech thee that thou wouldest keep us steadfast in this faith, and evermore defend us from all adversaries, who livest and reignest, one God, world without end. Amen. Now notice in this prayer we are praying that God, we are first, in a sense, thanking God that He has given us grace to know the Trinity. One of the first kind of key ideas of this course is going to be that the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, is plainly found in Scripture. But as articulated in the Nicene Creed, the Nicene Creed did not come down from heaven and just plop in front of us. It had to be mined out of Scripture that we might understand the doctrine of the Trinity, that we might understand who God is in His essence, and so what we'll see throughout this class is that God is providentially, graciously guiding His church towards a knowledge of Himself. Guiding His church through all kinds of influences towards coming to a right understanding of who God is and what it means that God, and really, most poignantly, who Jesus is. That Jesus is both God and man. And how does that work? That's really what the Council of Nicaea is all about. So, in May of 325, the Holy Roman Emperor, Constantine, walked into a room filled with about 200 to 300 bishops from all over the world. All these bishops have been offered, that the emperor has actually called this meeting together. Now, when I say Holy Roman Empire, you might think of something totally different, but it was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the emperor of Rome, had called a meeting in a small little town. Let's see if I can fly to it. In Nicaea. This town now goes by Iznik, Turkey. It's on. It's a beach town on this giant sea. I can't remember what the sea is. I think it's the Sea of Iznik. And it was his kind of summer home. In fact, he picked it because it was right near his palace in Nicomedia, which is up here. You can see that pretty well. And he picked that because it was the closest thing to him. It was it wasn't like he wasn't going to, the emperor's not going to travel. You're going to travel to him. But he did offer to pay for the traveling expenses for people to come. And the emperor, all the bishops are gathered. The bishops show, some of them are literally bearing the marks of the most recent persecution that has happened. Some of them don't have their right eye. Some of them are maimed on their left leg. They have undergone one of the worst persecutions in Christian history. And now the emperor of Rome, a persecution that was led by the emperor of Rome, but now 20-ish years later after that persecution, the emperor of Rome is actually calling this council. And it's the first time, it's not the first council that's happened, but it's the first time that there's been a massive, all of the bishops in the churches should gather. I think a couple thousand bishops in total were invited. The number is very vague on who actually came, but we know it's somewhere between 200 to 300 bishops came to the council, and Constantine, the emperor, right there in the purple, he makes a grand, and on this picture right there, he makes a grand entrance into the council room and sits among the bishops. The emperor of Rome is going to sit with the bishops as they figure out how to resolve this controversy that's been brewing. Now, if this was a movie, the first scene of the movie and how we're going to tell the story would be the doors opening and the emperor in all of his grandeur walking in. All the bishops stand, he walks in, and rather than remaining standing until all the bishops have seated, and then he actually sits down first. He's actually in some ways trying to show that he wants to be with them, not kind of lording over. Now, he's still the emperor, so he's got his whole regal thing. But the opening scene of this movie would be all these bishops gathered with all of their baggage, literally, and there are two key bishops, one key bishop and one key presbyter in the room. The key bishop that we'll talk about, we'll get to next week, is Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria. If you ever wonder if you were born to be a bishop, his name was Alexander, and he was the bishop of Alexandria.
So where were you born?
Exactly. If there's ever a Jeredonia, I shall be the bishop there. And that's the only place I'll end up being a bishop, probably. But and his a presbyter under him, named Arius, have had a squabble. Both have accused each other of heresy at this point. Arius has been kicked out of Alexandria. He's been gathering support. And the whole church is threatening a massive fracture. And Constantine has called the bishops together to solve this problem, to bring unity. Now, if this was a movie where we would, at that point, you know the meme where it's like, I bet you're wondering how I got here. It all freezes. I think it's Ratatouille is where, but it would freeze and say, now how do we get here? How do we get to the point where the Roman emperor, like in the line of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus and Nero, this is not the King of England, right? The Roman emperor is calling a council of Christian bishops to discuss a theological dispute. In this class, for the first probably 2 weeks, I want to talk about how we got there. This class will go over the history, the characters, the theology, and the aftermath of the great ecumenical councils of the 4th century. There are two. Now, I know I call this council Nicaea because Nicaea is one that the first kind of salvo of this, and its effects linger on throughout the whole 4th century, and they will coalesce in 380, where there's another council, in the Council of Constantinople, that kind of seals the deal. Only to, there be further controversies elsewhere. But this course will go over basically these ecumenical councils. Ecumenical meaning all the church. The church at this time, like the Roman Empire, it kind of followed the Roman Empire, was divided into East and West. And so the Eastern and the Western churches gathering together, representing all of Christendom, to figure these things out together. We'll talk about the heroes, the villains, and the backstory. I hope that it feels a little bit like a narrative, like that this isn't just a lecture, because I really don't know enough to be lecturing. But I hope we can tell the story in an interesting way. A few basics, a couple basic terms that we'll be using throughout the class. I just want to get on the out in the front. Heretics. Now, I don't know why that happened right there. That right there, I thought I turned off. What is that? That's dumb. Okay, so heretics. When we say heresy, we mean, it's from the Greek, I think it's hiero, meaning to choose. And heretics are those who willfully choose to go against the received teachings of the church. Now, sometimes we have this idea of heresy. You have this idea a lot in history now, where it's like history is written by the winners. You can't really trust anything in history because everything was written by, it always shuts out. You have the who's the guy? Is it Zen? Who wrote the People's History?
Howard Zinn.
Howard Zinn, where he's like, you can basically trust nothing. Everybody's awful. Everything's horrible. Everything that you thought was valiant was really just manipulative covering up of, there is no virtue. There's no courage. There's nothing good. It's really, it shows a happy person who writes that kind of history. But so we have this idea that like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code kind of popularized this, where in the 4th century you have multiple Christianities, and whoever wins is orthodoxy, and whoever loses is now a heretic. Now, in some ways, there is some truth to that, in the sense that some of these heresies are not formally and officially declared heresies until the whole church gathers together. However, what we'll find is that the church is gathering together to best articulate what they've already been teaching in contradiction to this new teaching. And heretics are not accidental, oops, I misunderstood type of people. They were sincere. Sometimes they were sincerely trying to help. But they were willfully trying to solve problems that the scriptures presented about who God is in many ways. Most of the time, heretics in the church, next week we're going to talk all about the heretics, the big heretics. But most of the time what heretics are doing is they are trying to smooth out rough edges. And so sometimes they're cruel, sometimes they're power hungry, but most of the time they are trying to help Christianity sound like it makes more sense when things were fuzzy. And a lot of times the church was a little bit behind the 8 ball because what they do in the Council of Nicaea, for instance, is say, okay, we know that Arius is wrong. How do we explain this? What can we put anything forward that would say, this is what we mean when we say that Jesus is God, and God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are one God. 3 persons, one God. And so a lot of times orthodoxy is it's not behind heresy as in it's being determined by heresy, but it is behind heresy, and then they don't know how to answer every question until the questions come up. And then when the questions come up, they gather together. So heretics are those who willfully choose to go against the received teachings of the church. Orthodoxy, from the Greek right, ortho, teaching, is the term. Now, sometimes orthodoxy gets used as a denominational, like Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. Orthodoxy is there's Protestants, there's Catholics, and Orthodox. That's not how we're using it. That's more of a proper noun. We're using it to describe classic Orthodox, the Orthodox faith. And what we'll find in this class is that the question in Christianity, and one of the reasons why I'm excited to walk through this class together, is that Christianity, what you'll find, if you go back and look at it, was not about what we think it's often about, which is like sincerity. Well, he means well. Everybody follows God in their own way. What do we mean by that? Well, as long as you're sincere in your faith, then you're good. That was not the understanding of Christianity ever. And it still isn't today, properly understood. It's not a question of sincerity. Arius, the guy, that guy on the floor right there, who's weeping at being just trounced by this council, just that kind of joke, but very sincere, sincerely believed what he believed. The question was not over Arius' sincerity. The question was whether Arius was right or wrong. And that's really what I hope all of us as Christians begin to remind ourselves and maybe recommit ourselves to. The question of truth is the central question of Christianity. Now, truth has an obligation to it, right? Like, truth has a moral obligation. You ought to believe the truth. You ought not believe a lie. Anyone who willfully believes a lie, we would say that's you shouldn't do that. So you ought to sincerely hold to the truth, but the truth is the main question. Okay, so background. How did we end up here? This week we're going to go over the political background. Next week we'll go over the theological and ecclesial background. One of the works that I found very helpful for this week, I'm just going to try to, throughout the course, point out to you different things that I'm using. So in case you are interested in contradicting me, you can. Or if you want to know more, you can. One, this book by Leo Donald Davis, The First Seven Ecumenical Councils. None of these books are particularly expensive, by the way, if you ever want to grab them. It has been really great, really helpful. This book we'll be talking a lot more next week, called The Cruelty of Heresy, by Bishop C. Fitzsimmons Allison. He's one of my favorite authors. And this is all about the pastoral implications of heresy. Because sometimes we view heresy as like, well, it's just checking the right box. And he's saying, no. Heresy actually is cruel. It puts people stuck in their own sin and their own mess without access to a God who can actually help them. And this book really, really is beautiful. It's a wonderful book. And this one I think you can get very cheap. And then this book for today, we're going to use it by Peter Leithart, called Defending Constantine. Constantine gets a bad rap these days. Thank you for that. And today will be a little bit about Constantine and his background. So we're going to go over the political background. Next week we'll go over theological and ecclesial background. Okay. One thing you'll notice, that this is not clean and easy and nice and neat. I mentioned in the 8:30 service, if you've ever been cynical about the church, you think it's all a mess. You're right. It is a mess. Bishop C.F. Allison, in this book, Cruelty of Heresy, says, personalities, politics, and intrigue were factors in the development of creedal statements. Christianity has never promised its adherents a purely spiritual arena, with wise and selfless leaders working out pure doctrine insulated from and uncontaminated by politics, rivalry, partisanship, fear, strife, and other works of our fallen nature. Then, as now, I love this line, God has only sinners to do God's work. Then, as now, God has only sinners to do God's work. That perhaps, for some of you, this class might redeem in some ways the church, because you might realize that there has never been a shining moment of purity in the church. Go back to the New Testament. Paul is writing letters going, what are you doing? I just left. And there's a guy in your church, a high up leader in your church is having an affair with his mother-in-law. I just left. Get him out. There's never a point that you can go back to and find, and if there was, it didn't last very long. Maybe like a month, of bliss. Just like your marriage. It was like a month of just pure bliss, and then you actually realize you're dealing with a real human being. And then it was a challenge, And yet, there's goodness in that. And yet you find that even though a person might be difficult, there's goodness. And there's truth and there's beauty in the midst of this relationship. Well, so with the church, we're going to find everybody's complicated. Everybody's got some rough edges. And yet what we'll see throughout all of it is a providential God orchestrating events that we might come to get these great statements of who he is. Okay, so background, Roman emperors. Now, the first Roman emperor was who? It's kind of a tricky question, but who first? Julius Caesar almost kind of became a little bit close, and then they killed him, and then his nephew, Augustus, becomes the first Roman emperor, and Augustus treated the being the emperor very subtly. He didn't wear big robes. He kept the same kind of Roman tunic. He was called the princeps. He was a first among equals in a sense. Now he had the army, so it was like a little bit of first among equals, but I can do whatever I want. But he also knew that an empire the size of Rome had to be, you had to spread out the governance. You could not, one person, rule everything because it just wouldn't, you have places all the way over in Africa, in Palestine, all the way up in England. There's no way. So what Rome really was a kind of a federation of states and principalities in a sense that all had adherence and loyalty to the emperor and paid taxes to the emperor and were given the protection of the empire. But for the most part, there was a lot of diversity within Rome. There was a lot of religious diversity. It was actually very pluralistic. They didn't mind other religions. And Jews could be a part of the Roman Empire. Christians early on at points could be a part of the Roman Empire. And so you have Caesar Augustus. He starts, and then the Roman Empire is actually pretty good. I mean, not morally good, but pretty solid up until Nero. Nero dies in the late 60s, 69, I think. He commits suicide after being kind of ousted by his guards. And now the other thing that happened so far was that the succession of the Roman Empire just happened within Caesar's family. Now they're entering into a world where, well, if guards can start to, kick out the emperor, who knows what's about to happen? Well, then you have some tumultuousness right in 69 AD. I think you have 4 emperors in the same year, kind of day after day, a different emperor kind of showing up. Then it gets some stability again up until Commodus, who is famous in Gladiator. That has no bearing to the actual Commodus, but that is Commodus. And Commodus is also murdered. But then when Commodus is murdered, you start to get about a ton of different, just a mess. The whole empire just goes, for hundreds of years, becomes a mess. Couple things start to happen. One, the immigration into the Roman Empire drove people into away from farms into cities, and so the agricultural heart of the empire starts to fall apart. There's a devaluation of the currency because each emperor keeps printing more and more, to where at one point I think the silver coin was only actually 5% actual silver anymore. And it was worth 50,000 less than what it had been. I don't know economics, but massive devaluation of the currency. But each emperor gained power by keeping the army happy. Their goal, if we can keep the army happy, we think that we'll remain in power. And each emperor couldn't do it. The army would get unhappy and they would kill them. Then you have you have kind of incursions in the empire. You got the Persian Empire in the east, who's constantly, they're like the eternal enemy of Rome. At one point they even take captive and kill the Roman emperor, Valerian. And then you have the Gauls and the Britons up in the northwest. They're starting to make incursions. So you have all these incursions on either side. You got a massive devaluation in the currency, and you have this growing need for a uniformity. As all these threats are happening, you feel this need for the Roman Empire to be one. And so what begins to happen is throughout these years, the emperor becomes more and more of a religious figure. He adopts more of the Persian approach to being a ruler. The Persian approach to being a ruler was you were decked out head to toe in all of the grandeur and all of the sophistication. You were a god. The Romans begin to kind of incorporate some of that. And there begins to feel this need to have a massive worldwide, imperial-wide religion. And one of the problems that they kept running into was these monotheists, the Jews and the Christians, but more particularly the Christians. the Christians who kept growing became this kind of political problem because now they weren't actually a problem. They were only like 10 to 15% of the actual population. But they became this kind of sticking point in people's head of like, the gods, everything's falling apart because these people won't pray the way they're supposed to pray. These people won't do what we're all doing together. And so throughout those couple hundred years, you see different emperors at times persecute Christians. Now, where we need to be today, Carus became emperor in Rome while the actual emperor was out campaigning. The actual emperor Probus was killed as soon as they found out. I mean, I'm kind of in media res just saying this is how it was. One guy would say, hey, I'm the new emperor. And then as soon as that emperor, the real emperor, was out campaigning, fighting the Persians, his army was like, hey, by the way, they just said there's a new emperor, and they would kill him. And then Carus, he goes out to start campaigning. He campaigned against the Persian, and then he died because lightning struck his tent. And a historian said the lightning struck his tent, and that lightning happened to look like torches being thrown into his tent. All right, so he's sleeping. A couple torches hit and then what happened? Lightning hit the tent, caught on fire. He's dead.
What era is this? What?
This is like 280, 260, 280. Then that means his son, who was out there on the campaign with him, suddenly became emperor, and his son was named Numerian. That's him. You all remember Numerian. I'm kidding. You don't. He became emperor in July of 283 and died in November of 284, still out campaigning. Very slowly, was trying to get back to Rome, but just kind of died, and we don't totally... He was a weak man, and he had really bad eye problems, and so they would carry him in this covered litter, basically, like carry him around, and no, he's the emperor. No one is to open it because of his eye problems, and eventually after weeks of not seeing him, they smelled something, and the soldiers said, "I know what that smells like. I've been around it. It's a dead body." And they opened it, and he's dead in there, and has been dead for who knows how long. Now, what happens right then, when he dies, the commander of his guard, Diocles, sees an opportunity, and he blames Aper, A-P-E-R, Numerian's father-in-law, and gathers all of the army together right outside of Nicomedia, which I wish I would just keep open the thing. They're right out here. They've been Nicomedia. They're right outside there. Diocles seizes an opportunity. He says Aper killed him. Aper is Numerian's father-in-law, and he stabs him and kills him right in front of everybody. And all the Praetorian Guard say, well, you seem like a guy who's going to take charge. You just killed a guy in front of us. You're the new emperor. All right. And so Diocles becomes the emperor and is known as Diocletian. So Diocletian becomes the emperor in November of 284. Now, interestingly about Diocletian, he was a highly religious person, and he had a druid prophesy that he was going to become emperor if he killed, and he would become emperor by killing a wild boar. And guess what the word for boar is in Latin?
Aper?
Aper. So Diocletian, when he sees this happening, there's a standpoint of him just taking advantage of a situation, but there's also a standpoint of him thinking, I have a divine, this is my moment. I'm chosen. Aper's right in front of me. If I kill him, I become emperor. And he does. So now Diocletian, he had been the commander of the guard for Numerian. Now he's smart. He realizes none of this is working. The emperor can't be trying to run the whole empire, because every time he goes out to deal with one of these problems, the Persians in the east, the Britons up in the west, he gets murdered, and then or somebody else goes down to Rome and says, "Hey, by the way, I'm the new emperor." And then he says, "Okay, this thing's too big for one person to run." So he starts what's called the Tetrarchy, where he officially divides the empire into east and west, and he has two emperors called Augusti, and two kind of right-hand men next to the emperors called Caesari, or Caesars. All right, and so that means there's an Augusti and an Augustus and a Caesar, and Augustus and a Caesar on either side, and so there's four men now, and the whole kingdom is split into four quadrants, and these four people are going to run it now. Each person can make edicts and things for their own thing. Diocletian is the only one who can make an edict for all of it. So he presents it as, you know what, we're going to divide up the power. We're going back to Roman Republic kind of vibes, and presents it as, I'm just one of you, but he still is the emperor, and he still is running the show. Now, this shows, oh man, it looks terrible on the TV. So the colors are totally washed there, but basically, this is how he kind of divides it up. Here is one, here is one, here's one, and here's one. All right. So the four. That's how he kind of divides up the Roman Empire, and he becomes in 303. So the people that he picks for this kind of thing are Diocletian. He's in the east, and his Caesar is called Galerius. Galerius is a hardcore pagan, hates Christians. And then he picks Maximian, and he picked him because he shared a birthday with him. Which is, in fact, one guy I think changes his name to sound like Maximian because Diocletian is so religious and so kind of looking for signs. Anything that he thinks is kind of chosen, he's going to go with. So other people are trying to jockey themselves into, well, I want to get chosen. So he picks Maximian to be the Augustus in the west. For Maximian, they pick Constantius Chlorus as his Caesar. So you have Maximian in the west, and then Constantius. Now Constantius gets sent up into England to deal with the Britons up there. Diocletian is in the east with Galerius. They're dealing with the problems down there. And actually the whole thing begins to work. Things kind of get back in order. There's not as much chaos. And then in 303, Diocletian begins to persecute Christians in Nicomedia. Again, going back to what I was saying, Diocletian felt there was this need to get everybody on the same page, everybody worshiping the way we ought to worship. And one of the first peoples that wouldn't do that is the Christians. So it starts pretty, not small, but pretty major in the sense of Christians are kicked out of the imperial, like anywhere in the army, anywhere in Roman kind of imperial hierarchy. If you're a Christian, you're out. Then churches begin to be burned. And then at some point, there's a fire that happens in Nicomedia. And that fire gets blamed on the Christians. And Galerius is probably behind the scenes pushing Diocletian to do this. And the persecution in Nicomedia then begins to be extremely hard. I want to read a quick little segment about what that persecution looked like in Nicomedia. Where was that? I folded the page and then I can't. Peter Leithart writes this: after the palace fire, Christians in Nicomedia, quote, perished wholesale and in heaps. Some butchered with the sword, other fulfilled by fire, end quote. Some Christians were so eager to share in martyrdom that they leaped into the flames. Some were tied up, placed in boats, and thrust out from the beach. One Christian, named Peter, refused to comply with the order to sacrifice. So Diocletian had ordered that everyone in the imperial empire needed to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Some Christians would, just to be spared. Other Christians would not. A Christian named Peter refused to comply with the order to sacrifice. Soldiers stripped him, hoisted him naked, and whipped him until his body was a bloody pulp, his bones sticking through the flesh and skin. Still, he refused to sacrifice. The soldiers brought vinegar and salt from the mess and poured it over his wounds. Finding raw meat unappetizing, even when spiced up, they decided to cook him, slowly roasting parts of his body while trying to keep him alive. He was still refusing to sacrifice when he died. In the Thebais, Christians were torn to bits from head to foot with potsherds like claws. In the same place, a woman was hung upside down completely naked. Others were torn in two. Each leg was tied to a bent tree, and then the soldiers would let the bows, quote, fly back to their normal position. Thus, they managed to tear apart the limbs of their victims in a moment. One Christian woman in Antioch convinced her daughters that they should preempt the persecutors by seeking safety in death, and they threw themselves into the rivers. Eventually, they thought, this is too brutal. We need to dial it back, but still keep persecuting. And so what they did, Eusebius, the historian writing about this, said the beneficence of the humane imperial authority ought to be extended to everybody, no one henceforth being punished with death. They had already ceased to impose this penalty on us, thanks to the emperor's humanity. Yet imperial humanity, Peter Leithart writes, yet imperial humanity left something to be desired. Orders were then issued that the eye should be gouged out and one leg maimed, so that as a result of this humanity shown by God's enemies, it is no longer possible to count the enormous number of people who first had the right eye hacked out with a sword and cauterized with fire, and the left foot rendered useless by branding irons applied to the joints. So that became one of Diocletian's favorite ways to persecute Christians, was to give them a mark that they could never get rid of. The right eye torn out, their left leg maimed, basically, to be unusable. A lot of this was religious in essence, not just in its persecution, but how they persecuted. When you're slow roasting people, what the Romans were really saying was, you're going to sacrifice whether you want to or not. You know, you might not offer a sacrifice, but you will be offered as a sacrifice to the gods. Crucifixion, Romans love to do this. Crucifixion was specifically for people who thought they could rise above their station. And Romans would say, you want to rise above your station? We'll raise you up on a cross, in front of everybody. And so the persecution is widespread, and it is really brutal. Eventually, it does begin to subside. The tetrarchy begins to kind of fall into... In 305, Diocletian does something that had never been done before. He had gotten really sick out when he was out campaigning, and he sees that if he dies, and this whole thing, it's just going to go back into the mess of all of the succession. So what he does is something that no one had ever done before. He retired as Roman emperor. In 305, he retires. He forces Maximian to also retire, and he retires over to the coast of Yugoslavia and raises cabbages while he waits to die. And Galerius becomes the Augustus, and he gets Maximum Dia to be his Caesar, and Constantius becomes the Augustus. Now, what's interesting is, in Galerius' court was Constantius' son, Constantine. And Constantine should have been picked to be Caesar, but Galerius knew Constantine was Constantius' son, and he thought Constantine was a little too ambitious, so he picked another guy over him. Well, that made Constantine mad, and so Constantius asked Galerius to send Constantine, his son, over to him in England, and Galerius eventually allows him to go. And as soon as he allows him to go, Constantine that night gets up and leaves and maims all of their horses, because he knows Galerius is going to change his mind. And he books it for England. And Galerius tries to pursue him, but their horses they can't do it. Then Constantine, he appoints Severus to be his Caesar. Now, Severus is killed. Hijinks ensue. This guy, Maxentius, who is Maximian's, all these names. Maxentius is Maximian's son. So Constantius goes over him to appoint Severus. Galerius actually appoints Severus to be his Caesar, because Galerius could control Severus. That was what happened. Maxentius is angry that he gets passed over, so he kills Severus. Now, so the tetrarchy that was supposed to create this succession plan that would work is not working because they're all killing each other, and sons don't like to be passed over for what they feel like is rightfully in this world, and including today. If you're a son in a business and at the end, the other guy gets appointed, you're like, that was mine. It was supposed to be mine. Anyways, Maxentius, he kills Severus, and Maxentius and Constantine. So Constantine gets up to Constantius, and Constantius dies in 306 in York, England. And Constantius had brought Constantine up to him because he knew that Maxentius would try to become the next Augustus. And he didn't want that. And so he wanted his troops to love Constantine. So Constantine was a great warrior. When Constantine was operating under Galerius, Galerius hated him. He would send him into the thick of fighting to try to get him killed. At one point, Constantine even brought back a live barbarian to Galerius and killed him in front of him to prove, you can keep doing this all day long. I'm going to be just fine. And so Constantine was a great warrior. Brave, courageous, smart. His troops loved him. So when Constantius dies, his troops immediately, now Maxentius is the Caesar. His troops immediately declare Constantine to be Augustus. So remember, that's the step up. Galerius pronounces that Constantine is actually only the Caesar. And so now you have a 5. You've got Galerius and Maxentius. You've got Constantine, Maxentius, and there's one other guy in there. So all of this leading towards... So now there's going to be a battle brewing, all right? Because all this can't stay going for very long. Maxentius was extremely unpopular. He was down in Rome, and he began to tax Rome. Now, part of living in Rome in that time was you didn't get taxed, you received the tax. But part of the advantage of living in the capital was that you didn't get taxed. And Maxentius said, no, actually, we're going to start taxing you, which is not the greatest move to get people to like you. So eventually, Galerius sends Severus to that. Severus actually was still alive during that. That's the 5th one. Believe it or not, this is confusing. Severus gets sent by Galerius. Severus is actually over with Galerius. He gets pronounced Caesar. Constantine is also Caesar, and Maxentius is trying to be Augustus. All right, so that's where the 5 come into play. Now, Galerius sends Severus to attack Maxentius in Rome. Severus gets to the gates of Rome, and his troops are looking at a fortified Rome and going, we're supposed to attack that. And he's like, yeah, we're going to attack that. And Maxentius basically bribes a couple of Severus's troop commanders. Hey, do you want to die attacking this fortified greatest city that's ever been existed? Or do you want to just come join me? And they say, we'll join you. So they turn on Severus. Severus gets killed by Maxentius. Then Galerius comes over and tries to kill Maxentius. And he gets to Rome, and the same thing happens. He gets outside of Rome. Maxentius bribes him. And Galerius' troops start to fall apart. And it all kind of... And Galerius realizes, I'm going to get killed just like Severus. So Galerius leaves. Now, all this leading to Constantine. He comes down to attack Maxentius. And in the Battle of Milvian Bridge, right before the battle, Constantine sees a vision in the clouds, and the vision is of a cross, and it says, under this sign you shall conquer. And Constantine becomes a Christian.
In hoc signo vinces.
That's right. In hoc signo vinces. And he has all of his troops bear this sign on their cross. This is the Chi Rho. Chi, CH, Rho is R, the first 2 letters of Christ. All of Constantine's army holds this shield. Constantine's army had been weakened through his campaign through Italy, and he gets to the Milvian Bridge. Outside of Rome, and Maxentius, for whatever reason, decides this time he's not it was actually over here. He's not going to sit behind the gates and try to bribe. He feels, because he received a vision that he would have victory, he feels confident. He rides out, brings his troops across the Tiber River, so that both troops, Constantine's are up here, Maxentius is down here. Both troops have the river at their back, which is never what you want. Maxentius thinks, if I put my troops in position where they can't retreat, they'll fight harder. It's not what happens. Constantine routs them, and not only routs them, when they're trying to cross the bridge collapses, and most of Maxentius' army, including Maxentius himself, drowns. And Constantine becomes the sole Augustus in that's them drowning in the river. And notice when they paint it, who's on their side? God, angels. So Constantine becomes the sole Augustus. Then Constantine goes over and defeats Galerius's successor, and in 324 becomes the Holy Roman Emperor of all of the Roman Empire. And we've got to go, but he really did become a Christian. Well, I'll talk about that later next week. He's a complicated character, but he really did believe that he was divinely appointed at what he was. Nothing that he did should have worked. Maxentius should have never left the gates. None of this should have ever happened. Two other guys had tried to attack Rome, and it had fallen apart in front of him, and he, with a smaller force, defeated him, went over, defeated the East, and became the emperor. And so it's not hard for Constantine to believe, God really has appointed me for something. All right, so I got to run.